So this story has always intrigued me as a kid. This is the Shootout at the White Elephant Saloon. Unfortunately, a lot of the facts have been kind of either inflated or misconstrued for one reason or another. I'm just going to say this right now. The White Elephant in its current state is in the Fort Worth Stockyards, which is not the original location. That White Elephant Saloon opened up in the 1970s and is now currently owned by a huge umbrella corporation that pretty much owns everything in the Stockyards. Any bar you pretty much go to in the Stockyards is owned by this company. Just a disclaimer. So I believe there has been some deceptive practices in their advertising and promotions when it comes to the White Elephant Saloon. They've never blatantly came out and said this is the original location, but the way their marketing is, it would have you believe that. So I'm here to clear that up right now, because the unknowing tourist coming to Fort Worth to see the White Elephant Saloon more than likely doesn't know that. So this story begins in 1886. And at that time, Fort Worth was at a crossroads. It was no longer really a frontier town. The railroad had come through. A lot of industry was booming in Fort Worth. A lot of commerce was happening. It was very much on its way to a modern city at this time. But it's kind of two cities in one, really, if you think about it, because on one side of town you had all this commerce and advancement towards the future of Fort Worth, and then to the south side of Fort Worth, you still kind of had the Old West and the red light district and just all this crazy stuff going on down there. But that's where this story gets really confusing, because a lot of articles, a lot of things out there will tell you that the White Elephant was in Hell's Half Acre, which is the south side of Fort Worth, which that's absolutely incorrect. The current White Elephant and the original location of the White Elephant never existed in Hell's Half Acre. Hell's Half Acre was about 9 blocks south of the current courthouse, and it was known for lawlessness. It was known for crime. It was known for brothels. It was known for all that Wild West stuff, even in 1886. So that's something a lot of people have a problem with when you start telling this story, is what they know as the White Elephant isn't facts. It's not factual. The original location of the White Elephant Saloon was 3 blocks south of the courthouse, which was considered uptown, which was the better side of town, the more established side of town. You had all the commerce and all that, and the White Elephant wasn't some little hole-in-the-wall saloon with, you know, a bunch of roughneck cowboys in there gambling and fighting. No, this was the place where a lot of the big money men would go. The cattlemen, all that. That's the place they would go. They had a restaurant, they had a bar, and they had gambling upstairs. It was actually on the gambling circuit. This is like, you know, this is like the place to be when you're going to gamble. It's not just some little hole in the wall. I mean, you had people like Bat Masterson, Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp visiting this establishment. I know this contradicts a lot of what Hollywood has done and a lot of stories that's been written about it. But at the end of the day, it's the truth. So our two characters, Luke Short and Jim Courtright. Jim Courtright went by several names. He was known as Long-Haired Jim Courtright. He was a marshal at one time. He made The crime in Fort Worth go way down. But he was ruthless. He was a very ruthless man. He would not think twice about shooting somebody if he thought they needed it. He's a very complex individual because there are stories of him being kind and compassionate, but there's also a lot of stories of him being ruthless. So he's a very hard individual to read. For one example, several years, I want to say a couple years before the White Elephant incident, there was a shooting, an accidental shooting, involving this young man and Jim Courtright. Jim Courtright was shot, almost killed the man. They locked the young man up that shot him, and Jim Courtright actually went to the judge and told him, hey, let's take it easy on this kid. It was a misunderstanding. I don't want to ruin his life over this. He doesn't deserve this. So there's that aspect of him. But he was, all intensive purposes, a gunslinger. He was a rounder. He was a product of the Civil War. He was a scout and sharpshooter for the Union. He had all kinds. He served in some sort of law enforcement capacity pretty much his whole adult life. If he had a resume, it would read something like this: hired killer, deputy marshal, U.S. Marshal, bailiff, private eye, and a racketeer. He also used to travel with the Wild Bill exhibition shows where he was a sharpshooter. He was extremely good with a gun. There is no contesting that. Everything you ever read about this man, he was extremely deadly and extremely accurate with a gun. That's not disputed whatsoever. And then you have Luke Short. Now, Luke Short, by all accounts, is a businessman. He had been ran out of Dodge City for practicing in some gray areas of the law, per se, but he was really savvy with how to get around certain types of things and stay legal. So he was ran out of Dodge City over some stuff like that. He's also a gambler. He set up shop in Tombstone for a while. He made his way to Fort Worth. And that's something else that needs to be understood about these two characters. Jim Courtright and Luke Short have known each other for years. From Dodge City to Tombstone to Kansas to Fort Worth, these guys knew each other. Now, it's hard to decipher from historical documents whether these two are friends or were they just close acquaintances. That's kind of hard to really decide just reading things. But it should be noted that their group of friends, their circle of friends, was all the same people. And when I say that, I mean Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson. All those guys knew each other in some form or fashion. So like I said, Luke Short, businessman. He ends up being part owners of the White Elephant. So the whole story really begins when one day Jim Courtright comes to the White Elephant and he meets up with Luke Short. And that's something that needs to be said before I go any further. At this time, Jim Courtright was no longer in any capacity a lawman at this time. He had since moved on to open a private detective agency. Now, this agency did some backhanded criminal things. They would essentially offer protection to business owners for, a fee. Pretty much like the mob would do. So he ran a private eye agency, but they also did, racketeering on the side. And he went to Luke Short one day, said, hey, you should really hire me at the White Elephant as a special officer. Now, a special officer would imply like security, basically, is what he's implying. And Luke Short just replied to him, hell, I would actually pay you not to be in the White Elephant because Luke Short seen that as bad for business. You know, Jim Courtright had a reputation, and he didn't want that reputation tarnishing the image of the White Elephant. That's all it was. He did not mean any disrespect to the man over that. He was just being honest. He probably would have actually paid him not to be there. So the story goes that really pissed Jim Courtright off. He was a man you did not tell no. You did not tell this man no. Later in the night, Jim Courtright shows back up at the White Elephant. He's been drinking, and a man named Jake Johnson, who was a mutual friend of Luke Short and Jim Courtright's, met Jim Courtright at the door. And Jim Courtright's like, I'm here to see Luke Short. So he went and got Luke Short, and he said, hey man, Jim Courtright's here to see you. He seems a little agitated, and I think he's been drinking, so just, be careful. So Luke Short steps outside the White Elephant. Bat Masterson was also there. So Luke Short and Jim Courtright actually walked across the street and north away from the White Elephant, so that the shooting itself actually didn't even take place at the White Elephant like the title implies. It actually took place about a half a block from where the White Elephant originally resided, which was on Main Street. The only person that really witnessed this from beginning to end was Bat Masterson. I don't know what happened to Jake Johnson in that time frame. I know he escorted him outside, but I guess he did not walk with them. He let them kind of go off on their own to have their discussion. Nobody truly knows what the first few minutes of that conversation entailed. But what we do know is they crossed the street and they went north about a half a block up. And at that time it was, real popular. A lot of people wore, vest. And Luke Short was always dressed real nice, and he wore a vest. And he had this habit of taking his thumbs and sticking them in his armholes, when you stand there talking like this. And I'm pretty sure you've probably seen that in old westerns where the cowboys will have their thumbs stuck in their vest like this. And it was just a way a lot of people kind of stood back then. Well, Jim Courtright took that as him going for a gun. And Jim Courtright said something to the effect of, well, you don't have to go for your gun like that. Now, you need to understand, Luke Short never actually carried a gun on his hip. He looked like a businessman. He didn't have a gun hanging off his hip. He kept a little Derringer in his front pocket for protection, just like anybody would carry nowadays. It's just there for protection. He didn't have a customized holster for a quick draw or nothing like that. Whereas Jim Courtright was wearing his sidearm with his holster that was customized for quick draw and all that kind of stuff. So the story goes, Jim Courtright said, you don't have to go for your gun like that. But by that time that phrase was said, Jim Courtright had already started to draw. He drew his gun out of his holster. He cleared the holster, but he never got a shot off. Luke Short was able to pull his little pistol out of his pocket and proceeded to shoot Jim Courtright 3 times. Once in the chest, once in the thumb, and then once in the shoulder. And he ended up falling in the doorway of a shooting gallery, which was called Ella Black's Shooting Gallery. He fell over into the door. His feet were sticking out into the street. By all intensive purposes, Jim Courtright should have outgunned Luke Short, because Luke Short had to draw out of his pocket, whereas Jim Courtright had already drawn and cleared his holster. And there's 2 popular theories to what happened. The first theory is when he drew, somehow his watch chain got hung up in his gun and he couldn't get a shot off. and the second is his gun misfired. We don't really know what truly happened on why he didn't get a shot off, because he should have ended Luke Short's life right then and there that night. But that's not how it played out. The underdog, if you will, came out on top. So they ended up arresting Luke Short. They threw him in jail. It was a pretty quick trial, though, because even though the laws back then were kind of flexible and had a lot of gray areas, they did have laws. And when you shot somebody in the street like that, basically the law would read who drew first. Whoever drew first was already at fault. Obviously, Jim Courtright drew first. Luke Short shot him. That put him in the clear. It was a pretty speedy trial. So after all this is said and done, Jim Courtright is buried in the north side of Fort Worth in a very old cemetery. Luke Short ends up leaving town shortly after and setting up shop, I think, in Kansas by this point. 6 years later, Luke Short actually gets ill with kidney disease, and he dies. And the ironic thing about it is he ended up being buried in the same cemetery as Jim Courtright. It's a very intriguing story on how all this went down and all the misconceptions that are around this story. The original White Elephant was not in Hell's Half Acre. The Fort Worth stockyards, which were called the Union stockyards back then, were nowhere near Hell's Half Acre. That's one of the facts that gets missed a lot. And it's one that gets exploited a lot. A lot of people want to claim Hell's Half Acre this, Hell's Half Acre that, and it's just not true. In proximity of Hell's Half Acre? Yeah, sure. By 5 blocks. There was a 5-block separation from the White Elephant and Hell's Half Acre. But it was not in Hell's Half Acre. And then the other misconstrued fact. It's called the Shootout at the White Elephant. The shootout didn't happen at the White Elephant. It happened across the street and half a block down at Ella Blackwell's shooting gallery. If you look at the maps from then versus now, Ella Blackwell's was kind of in an alley. The alley doesn't exist no more, but there is a current building standing pretty close with an entrance to where Ella Blackwell's would have been. So it's kind of cool that you can actually go there and still see the location of where this happened. The original White Elephant building no longer exists. It was tore down in the early 1900s and rebuilt. So the building that's there now was built in the early 1900s, but it is not the original location, but it's still the same address. I'm not too sure what's actually there now. Last time I looked, it was vacant. I'm sure it's not vacant now, but I'm not too sure what's there at the current time. But yeah, that's it. You have these two gentlemen that went out to talk, and one ended up dead. And after doing a lot of reading and research on this, neither one of these men intended on having a gunfight that night. That was not in the cards. But it ended up that way. Pretty much marks the last known Wild West gunfight of the West. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, share, and I will see you next time.